Today we're going to be talking about tweaks in the configuration options that can make your experience with the HUD a little bit smoother. If you're watching this video, it means that the HUD should be already up and running. It should be functioning. These are additional tweaks you can make to improve the functionality of the HUD even further. Let's start off with the HUD tab in the configuration options setting. We're only going to have a look at the relevant options. We're not going to consider everything. The first area I'd like to draw your attention to is the option that says minimal HUD scaling percentage. The idea behind this option is if you had that at 95%, it means that when you resize the tables to a smaller sizing, the HUD is forced to stay at 95% size at the absolute minimum. In other words, you end up with small tables and very big HUD panels. Now that's not very helpful because it covers a lot of the information you need to see on the table, especially if you're multi-tabling. So in order for the HUD to scale as small as possible when you resize your tables, you probably want to go to minimal HUD scaling percentage and select 0. Remember, every time you make a tweak in the config options here, there is a save option in the top right. If you don't click that button, then the changes may not take effect. So we have to click save in the top right. Now the option we've just set is not going to have any significance if we don't also make sure that scale font sizes in HUD along with table size is set to on. If that was set to off, it means that the HUD panel doesn't change in size when we resize the table. We want to make sure that's on. It should be on by default, but you might find the minimal HUD scaling percentage is set quite high by default. We want to set it to a low setting. 0% is probably good unless you're using really small tables. I've tried the 0% minimal HUD scaling percentage with the smallest size tables at PokerStars, and everything is still extremely visible on the HUD panel. If you found that you couldn't really read the HUD very well when you have very small tables, you can just set this to 40% instead of 0, or whichever value you require. Keep in mind the goal here is to make sure that while the HUD panels need to be visible, they don't want to be concealing important information such as stack size, hole card information, the position of the button. You get the idea. You should be able to see everything on the table. If you can't, it might indicate that your HUD panels are too big. There are some other configuration options on this tab we might want to think about changing. First one is show sample. If you turn this on, it means the stats on your main panel will have a small number next to them indicating the sample size. I have this turned off, but if you want to turn it on, that's really your preference. Show versus hero stats. Now I keep this turned off. The way this works, Hand to Note will attempt to specifically show your opponent's versus hero stats as opposed to his overall stats. This can be somewhat misleading, however, because it's turned on by default, and when you're looking at your opponent's HUD panel, you might think you're getting information on his overall stats, when in fact you're getting information on how he's playing against you when the sample size gets above a certain amount. This can be very, very confusing for a player that's transitioning from another tracking software because they're not used to the HUD showing versus hero information. So while I think this is a very useful feature and it has very good application, it should absolutely not be turned on by default in the Hand to Note settings. So I recommend at first you come here and turn it off. If you want to take a slightly more advanced approach, turn it on. Make sure you run some parameters for when it shows versus hero stats as opposed to the overall stats. For example, show versus hero stat if versus hero sample is greater than. Make sure you put in a realistic value here that makes sense. Or substitute by versus hero stat if versus hero sample is greater than. This is for the overall hand sample. I'm guessing you'd probably want to put something like 5,000 in here. Because otherwise, if you have this value set too low, there's going to be useful information about your opponent that you're missing out on because your HUD is only showing you statistics regarding how he plays against you. And that defeats the whole point of having the versus hero stats option. We want our decisions to be made more accurate, not less accurate. So if you do decide to turn this on, make sure you set parameters, and I recommend you assign these numbers quite high. So versus hero stat if hero sample is greater than, I wouldn't even put 15, I'd make it more like 50. Here I'd put something like 5,000, just as rough examples. However, by default, the HUD is designed to be used with show versus hero stats turned off. And the reason for this is, if you want to see versus hero stats, you can find that information in the pop-ups. For example, take something like the 3-bet stat on the main panel. With this option turned off, it's obviously going to show the generic 3-bet information against everyone. If we want to see how often that player is specifically 3-betting versus us, we can bring up the 3-bet pop-up, we can hover our cursor over the 3-bet stat inside that pop-up. In the window that pops up, it will show us how often that player is 3-betting specifically versus us. And one reason why that's especially useful is because if you just have the versus hero stat, you won't necessarily have anything to compare it to. What we're essentially interested in is not necessarily how much he 3-bets against us specifically, but whether he 3-bets against us more frequently than he 3-bets against the population. And in order to make that comparison, you need both values anyway. So this way you get the generic versus population value on the HUD. Then if you want to compare that to the versus hero 3-bet information, you can do that by just bringing up the pop-up. So if you don't have any strong feelings either way, I recommend you come here and turn off show versus hero stats. However, if you know what you're doing, it's optional to toggle this particular setting on, provided you assign realistic parameters for using that option. Otherwise, you could be denying yourself important information. In the hand view tab, by the way, I recommend you come here and just have a look at the information on the screen, just so you can get a better understanding regarding how the hand history preview works. There's a lot of information contained in this hand history preview, and the preview is this grey strip at the top where we can see a sample hand played. Now very often you have positional information here, you have bet and raise size info, you have pot size info, you have board texture info. This is a very condensed form of showing a hand history, and it's surprisingly complete given that it's so condensed. But in order to make the most use of this, you have to understand what the colors mean, what the numbers mean. You can learn that by coming here and looking at this output. You can even change the configuration if it makes it easier to remember what various things mean. You can change the colors of the cards, you can change the colors of the positions, etc. I don't necessarily recommend you change anything apart from perhaps one setting. We have this auto replay option here. This is on by default, I turn it off. Basically what this means is when you're looking at the hand history previews on a player and you hover your cursor over it, it can pop up a replayer and it starts playing through the hand. I find that quite annoying, so I decide to turn that off until I physically click the replay button and indicate that I definitely want to look at that hand. Again, this is optional. If you prefer to leave that on, completely fine. Now if we go to pre-flop diagram, this is how the heat maps look like. By the way, if you play on PokerStars, you won't be able to access the heat maps in-game, but you will be able to access them when you are reviewing hands in the replayer or if you're using the range research report. Now if you have a look at this particular output, let's imagine for example, this is someone's pre-flop range. It's not a very realistic pre-flop range, but what we're seeing here is two colors, where perhaps green indicates 3-bet and blue indicates cold call. Now let's say we're having a look at a stat which is 3-bet pre-flop, and we hover over that stat, it brings up the heat map. It's showing us the 3-bet information, but it also shows us the cold call information in the same pop-up. I find that can sometimes be not that helpful. After all, if I'm looking at the 3-bet pop-up, I really just want to see what my opponent's 3-betting. I don't necessarily have to see what he's cold calling as well. So rather than have the heat map appear like this, with both the raises and the calls in, it's possible for it to appear like this, where when you hover over that 3-bet stat, you're only going to get that grid on the left which shows you the 3-bet information. You're not going to get the cold call information. After all, if you wanted the cold call information, you'd go and have a look at the cold call stat. So again, this is optional, but I prefer it like this, where it's broken down into individual ranges. Now if you want it this way, you have to just make sure that display alternative preflop action range is turned off. So there's three options here, these top three, just turn them off. They're on by default, which means by default your heat maps will look like this. If you decide you prefer this output, that's completely fine, nothing wrong with that. I actually prefer it broken down individually into two separate ranges like this. I've now gone to pop up on stats. This HUD is really designed to be used with this option toggled on, open assigned pop-up by left mouse click. In other words, if you want to bring up a pop-up, you go to the HUD panel, you click on the stat where you want the associated pop-up to be brought up. By default, this option will be off, meaning that the pop-up appears when you hover. Now there's a reason why you should actually have the open assigned pop-up by left mouse click on, regardless of which tracking software you're using. That's because it allows you to make more flexible use of time, and when I talk about time I mean micro decisions when multi-tabling. You have the ability to bring up a pop-up on player on table 6, then go and make a decision on table 3 while you're still looking at the pop-up on table 6. There are basically techniques associated with making the best use of our time when multi-tabling. It's possible to learn some tricks to increase the number of tables you can play and to increase the efficiency of your decisions when mass multi-tabling. And one of the techniques is to make sure when you use your HUD, you have it set up so that you open pop-ups by clicking on them. That way the pop-up will stay there until you decide to click that pop-up off. So you can be making decisions on other tables while that pop-up stays open. If you hover, you have to keep your mouse in that place in order for the pop-up to stay open. So when you move your mouse away to make a decision on another table, that pop-up disappears. So you can't be clicking buttons in the background while analyzing a pop-up. So we can be a lot more efficient if we have this option turned on, and the Death Star HUD is designed to be used with this option turned on. So while it's still optional, I strongly recommend that you turn this option on and you activate the pop-ups by clicking on the stats on the HUD panel. I also recommend you turn this option down the bottom on, hide default pop-up on stat if another pop-up assigned. All of the stats on the main panel have pop-ups assigned as part of the Death Star HUD. It makes sense to turn this option on as well. So two options I recommend turning them on. First one here and the last option here. Again, remember to click save in the top right, otherwise you may lose some of the options that you have configured. Now on the stats appearance option, firstly note that there is an option for show versus hero stats in the pop-up. I recommend once more that you turn this off. You can access the versus hero information if you bring up the pop-ups on the stats in the pop-ups. That's one of the cool things about hand to note, by the way. The pop-ups have pop-ups. So if you see a certain stat in a pop-up and you want to know what the associated versus hero value of that stat is, you can bring up a pop-up by hovering your cursor over that stat and seeing what the versus hero stat is on that stat. It's calculated automatically for you by hand to note. There's one feature on this tab which I like in theory, but I don't like in practice, and it's this particular feature. Make stat transparent if its sample size is lower than 1. In other words, what this means is, let's say for example your 3-bet stat is orange. Well, let's say you have a sample size that's lower than the value assigned here. Let's say you put in 10, and let's say your opponent has had less than 10 opportunities to 3-bet. Rather than the 3-bet stat being displayed as orange, it will be displayed as dark orange. Hand to note used the term transparent. The result just seems to be that the stat looks darker. It's less vivid, it doesn't stand out as much. The problem with this in terms of the Death Star HUD, the color system involved is one where the aggression stats are represented using light, vivid colors, whereas folding stats are represented using darker colors. For example, c-bet stats on flop, turn, and river, the color used is a vivid cyan color, whereas the fold to c-bet stats on flop, turn, and river, the color used is a dark cyan color. There's a similar setup used for float bets, probe bets, delayed c-bets, fold to delayed c-bets. It's designed that way to aid memory, to help keep track of which stat represents what, and to avoid misreadings. It's a very good system. The problem is it doesn't work very well with the system proposed by hand to note, which is make stats darker or brighter based on the sample size. It really has to be one or the other. So by default, I recommend turning this option off. The way you turn this option off is to put a sample size of 1, because basically if there's a sample size less than 1, there's no information on the stat anyway. So as soon as there is a sample size of 1, it means the stat is going to be displaying at full opacity. There's not going to be any transparency involved with that stat. If so inclined, however, you can make use of this feature. Nothing wrong with that. You just have to keep in mind that darkness and lightness doesn't necessarily indicate what type of stat we're dealing with. It now indicates whether there is a decent sample size associated with that stat. To turn this feature on, you simply need to select a sample size at which point the stat becomes vivid and opaque as opposed to transparent. I would imagine it's probably a good idea to put something like 10 in here as a minimum value, but you can tweak it however you see fit. One final option that can make things a little bit smoother is to head on over to the Game Types tab. Here we can specify which HUD loads up depending on what type of game we're playing. It may be the case that you don't only play 6 max cash games. Perhaps you have a separate HUD you want to use for tournaments, separate HUD you want to use for full ring. You can configure all of that in this tab. We're primarily interested in this NL Cash 3 to 10 max tab for now. The Death Star HUD is specifically designed for 6 max cash games. All we need to do is go to the drop down box here, select Weasel's HUD, go to the pop-up and select Weasel's Death Star, save, that's it. Anytime we're playing a game which meets this specific criteria, then the Death Star HUD will load up. You can even make some adjustments to the criteria. For example, the HUD is not designed for 4-ring play. This is for 6 max cash game specialist. You might want to change that from 3 to 6, for example, and then save. Okay, so this completes the installation tutorials. There are some other configuration options we haven't touched on yet. It's a good idea to spend some time going through each of them and seeing if there are any additional tweaks you want to make to improve our HUD experience.